Chapter 15. Jarl Corby Plans. Robbie went over to stand beside Jarl Corby's chair, but he moved unwillingly, for he had never been inside the schoolmaster's house before, and he could see things there which made him uneasy. There was a human skull standing on the window sill, for instance, and this skull seemed to be grinning at him. From the rafters above his head dangled bunches of dried herbs that gave off a peculiar, musty odor. A book lay open on the table, a big book with pages so yellow in color that he guessed it must have been very old. Moreover, these yellowish pages were covered with writing that was all back to front, mirror writing. In fact, he remembered old Da had told them this was the kind of writing wizards used for their spells. "Closer, boy, closer," Jarl Corby said impatiently. "Walls have ears, they say, and this is only for the two of us to hear." Obediently, Robbie came closer, then gasped as Jarl Corby shot out a large hand to grip his arm. In growing fear, he looked down at the dark and beaky face upturned to him, and Jarl Corby grinned at the expression he wore. "You're still frightened of me," he said softly, "and that's good. It means you'll continue to keep your mouth shut about me, doesn't it?" For the life of him, Robbie could not say a word then. He simply nodded, and Jarl Corby went on. "Now listen. The important thing for you to do on Uphelly is to keep Elspeth in sight. Where she goes, Finlearson will go. Depend on that. And so you must never take your eyes off of her." "But she'll be visiting back and forward to all the neighbors, the way everyone does then," Robbie protested. "I could easily lose sight of her in the darkness when that happens." "If you do," said Jarl Corby grimly, "you'll lose her altogether, for you won't be there when Finlearson tempts her away with him." Robbie thought of how very dark it would be in the dark hours of Uphelly, and in spite of himself he began to shake. "The Trolls will be out on Uphelly," he whispered, "and you know it's on that night they have their greatest powers. Supposing I meet with some of them when I'm trying to keep Elspeth in sight?" "You'll do as your old Da taught you," Jarl Corby told him. "You'll cross yourself and say the words they hate to hear." Robbie stared in dismay at this, for nobody dared go out alone on Uphelly, however much they were blessed against the power of the Trolls. Moreover, he remembered, it was always young folk like him that were in special danger of being stolen away to the strange, secret mounds where they had their homes. Jarl Corby was still talking, however, so he had to force himself to listen. "The next thing for you to remember," Jarl Corby was saying, "is this. Only the Scuddler can save Elspeth. And so, the moment that Finlearson acts, you must act too. You must find the Scuddler. Also, if anything happens to make Nickel fall short of the part we hope he will play, remember that you still have the knowledge which will give you the whip hand over Finlearson. For only you can tell him that his sulky skin is in a different hiding place, and only you can lead him to it." "But if I go alone with him to that place," said Robbie in a deeper dismay now, "there won't be anyone to stop him getting the skin back, and then doing what he likes with me." "Yes, there will," Jarl Corby told him. "I will be there." "And you won't let him harm me?" Robbie asked fearfully. Jarl Corby loosed his grip on Robbie's arm and rose to his full lean height. His eyes went to the table and the book of mirror writing lying there, and softly he said, "I've already told you I want my revenge on Finlearson, and now I have found the very spell that will let me do that. And so now also you can be sure of one thing. When Finlearson comes out of that place where the skin is hidden, he will not be able to harm anyone ever again." Robbie backed a step. "Why?" he asked fearfully. "What kind of spell is that?" One that I mean to be as a big surprise to you as it will be to him, Earl Corby answered. Lifting his eyes from the book, he let them rest on Robbie. And now, until Aphelia, that is all I have to say to you. There was something so cruel in Earl Corby's look then, that Robbie was much relieved to hear this. Nervously, he backed even further, and once again, as soon as he was out of the door, he made for home with all the speed he could muster. His mother was baking when he got there, and the house was full of the smell of freshly made Yule bannocks. Elspeth was at the byre door, hanging up a charm to protect the cattle from the power of the Trows at Yule, and he went obediently to help her with this when his mother told him to do so. Robbie's heart was not in this matter, however, nor could he take an interest in any of the things that had always before made him happy during the Yule holidays. All he could think of now, in fact, was the end of the holidays and Aphelia, so that all the days before then began to take on the feeling of days passing in a long and seemingly endless dream. There was one thing, however, which stood out from the dream in which Robbie now moved, and this was the change that each of these passing days seemed to work on Nichol and Elspeth. Nichol, of course, had been growing steadily more sullen before that time, but gradually now he became so grim and scowling that people could hardly believe he had once been a cheerful, easy-going man. Elspeth, too, no longer laughed or sang as she went around the house, and the quieter she became, the more often her eyes looked on a certain trance-like that made her seem like a sleepwalker wandering about in broad daylight. It seemed to Robbie, too, that the times this trance came over her were always those when her eyes met Finlayson's gaze. And then, he noticed, Finlayson would smile his secret little smile. For a moment, also, the young and handsome appearance of his face would slip aside like a mask, and another face would look at Elspeth, a watchful, old and cunning face that held her fascinated the way Tam had been held fascinated on Finlayson's first night in the house. A great dread of these moments began to creep over Robbie, and very often he wondered why everyone else was so blind to everything that seemed so clear to himself. The truth of the matter, however, was still so far from every mind except his own, that no one saw anything at all remarkable in the situation. Nichol's grimness and sulking, they argued, was simply due to jealousy. A young girl like Elspeth, with such a decision ahead of her, was bound to be absent-minded. As for Finlayson, everyone continued to find him so pleasant and polite that they could hardly be expected to guess at the uncanny presence lurking behind the charm of his manner. It was quite the opposite case, in fact, for none of them could fail to mark that he quite put Nichol to shame with the way he refused to be upset by Elspeth's decision about waiting for the end of Aphelia to make her choice between them. At the Christmas and New Year celebrations, he danced with her as light-heartedly as he had ever done. Nichol, on the other hand, sat scowling in a corner, without even trying to persuade her to partner him, and this led Janet to speak up quite sharply, for she still had a soft spot in her heart for Nichol. Besides which, she had now begun to realize the debt that she and Peter owed Finlayson did not mean she was really happy to see their daughter wedded to a foreign man, who would very likely take her back with him to his own country. And so, by the time it came to the new year, she was ready to tell Nichol, "That's no way to get Elspeth to decide in your favor. Sitting there with a long face on you while the other fellow does all the courting. Aye, you'll have to stir yourself if you really want to win her," Peter added to this remark. But Nichol remained stubborn. "I courted Elspeth before Finlayson came," he argued, "and I've courted her since then, well enough to let her know I would be good to her, and she would be happy with me. Now she must decide for herself without me running after her and staring into her eyes the way he does." On the early evening of Aphelia, however, Nichol showed a different spirit, for he came to the house then, with a present of scarlet ribbons for Elspeth to tie in her hair. Janet by this time had set out food and drink for all the neighbors who would visit. Peter had tuned his fiddle. Elspeth had brushed her golden hair until the rippling shine of it was a dazzle to the eye. And staring greedily at this, Finlayson told her, "You look like a princess." Elspeth blushed to hear him speak so, and just at that moment Nickel entered the house. Finlayson added boldly, "And when you marry me, you will be princess of my whole kingdom." Peter and Janet smiled at this, taking it to be no more than a piece of romantic nonsense, but Robbie knew differently. The kingdom under the sea, he thought in horror, and in his mind's eye he saw Elspeth among the faces of all the other golden-haired girls who had once reigned as the great Selkie's princess, the girls who had tried to escape, the drowned girls. "I brought you a present, Elspeth," Nickel's voice broke into these thoughts, and Robbie watched him holding the scarlet ribbon out to her. She took them, smiling, and exclaiming over their color, and immediately began twisting them through the shining strands of her hair. For one wild moment then, Robbie thought all his troubles might be ended, for the way Elspeth looked at Nickel when she had done this seemed to show that he was the one she really wanted to choose. Nickel gave her look for look, and quietly he said, "I cannot make fine speeches the way he does, Elspeth. I have never learned such manners, but this I will say with all my heart. I will hold you tonight if he tries to take you from me, and I will never let you go from that hold." "Nickel," said Elspeth, with all her soul in her voice. "Oh, Nickel." And then Finlayson laughed, spoiling the moment for all of them. "You speak brave words," he told Nickel contemptuously, "but you have still to prove them, and the night is not out yet." "No more it is," exclaimed Peter, taking up his fiddle to cover the awkwardness he felt. For it looked then and there as if it would come to a fight between the other two, but Nickel turned on his heel, and it was Finlayson who danced with Elspeth then. Robbie watched Nickel stride from the house, knowing that Elspeth's last chance to declare for him had gone, and that everything now depended on himself and on Earl Corby's plan. Grimly then, he settled down to await the appearance of the scuttler and the other geysers, crouching in a corner with his hands twined in Tam's fur, and his eyes constantly marking the time on the grandfather clock. The geysers would be visiting every house in Blackness that night, he knew, and so it would be well after midnight before he could expect to see them. Yet still he rushed to open the door every time he heard footsteps and voices outside the house, and each time he was disappointed to find it was only more neighbors arriving. Tam became restless, whining and shivering uneasily, and he wondered if the creature could sense what would happen that night. The hands of the clock seemed to move so slowly that sometimes he thought they had stopped altogether. He stayed alert all the same, and at 1 o'clock in the morning, when the geysers came at last, he was at the door before anyone else could reach it. Flinging it wide open, he saw the whole mob of them standing there. The next moment, they were all around him, and from somewhere in the mob a voice, Nickel's voice, breathed in his ear, "All right, Robbie, I've fixed it." And so there was hope yet for Elspeth, Robbie thought triumphantly. Then, with his heart beating hard in the excitement of this moment, he was carried back into the room by the rushing entrance of the scuttler and the scuttler's men.